Signature. Research on interpersonal dynamics has found that unexpected silences in conversations, pauses longer than approximately 4 seconds, reliably produce increases in self-reported feelings of social threat, rejection sensitivity, and self-consciousness. Participants in these studies describe feeling less belonging, less self-esteem, and less meaningful in their interactions after experiencing prolonged silences, even in conversations that were otherwise positive. For seconds, a window shorter than it takes to read this sentence. The reason this happens so quickly connects back to a fundamental feature of how your social brain processes conversation. Talking is not just information exchange. At a deeper functional level, continuous verbal exchange is the primary signal your nervous system uses to assess whether a social connection is active and stable in real time. When the signal is flowing, when words are being exchanged, when the other person is responding, when the interaction is moving, the attachment monitoring component of your social brain receives continuous confirmation that the connection is intact. When a signal stops, even briefly, that continuous confirmation also stops, and the monitoring system, lacking real-time data, defaults to its baseline anxiety state. Something may have gone wrong. This is partly why the discomfort of silence feels specifically social rather than simply quiet. Silence when you're alone doesn't carry the same charge. The discomfort is calibrated to the presence of another person, because it's specifically the social monitoring system generating the alarm, and that system is only active in the presence of someone whose evaluation, engagement, and continued connection matter to you in some way. Here's where it becomes more specific and more interesting. The intensity of the discomfort produced by conversational silence isn't constant. It varies predictably based on 2 factors: the perceived power dynamic. There's a specific kind of discomfort that arrives in the middle of a conversation when talking stops, not when a conversation ends. That's a different thing entirely. But when you're mid-interaction, mid-connection with another person, and a silence opens up between you, and nobody says anything for what feels like a very long time, but is probably 4 or 5 seconds, something happens in that window. A low-level alarm activates. The silence starts to feel like something more than just a pause, like evidence of something going wrong, like a social transaction that has stalled and needs rescuing. And so you say something. Maybe you finish a thought you'd already finished. Maybe you comment on something nearby. Maybe you ask a question you're not particularly interested in the answer to. Maybe you laugh at nothing. Whatever it is, it arrives specifically to end the silence. Not because the content was pressing, but because the silence was. Most people do this. Most people do it without noticing. And almost nobody asks why. Specifically, the absence of noise between 2 people who are supposed to be engaged with each other activates something that feels genuinely uncomfortable rather than simply neutral. By the end of this video, you'll understand the precise mechanism that makes conversational silence feel like a social threat, why this discomfort is significantly stronger in some contexts than others, and what the research actually says about the function of silence in human connection, including why the compulsion to eliminate it often undermines the connection it's trying to protect. Stay until the end, because the final section explains something counterintuitive about silence that most people learn too late. Let's start with the neurological level, because the discomfort of conversational silence isn't simply a social convention. It has a measurable physiological pause. With people who hold more social power relative to you, a boss, an authority figure, someone whose approval carries particular weight, silences feel significantly more threatening than they do with equals or with people who hold less. This is because the social monitoring system is more vigilant in high-stakes evaluative contexts, and a silence from someone whose opinion matters more carries proportionally more ambiguity that gets resolved toward threat rather than toward neutrality. This is why many people who are perfectly comfortable with long, easy silences among close friends find themselves talking compulsively in the presence of a new employer or a person they're trying to impress. The content of the conversation isn't more valuable in the second case. The monitoring system is simply more activated. The ambiguity factor is equally important. A silence that has a visible, understandable cause, both people are reading something or eating or watching something, carries almost no discomfort because the reason for the absence of words is clear. The monitoring system has an explanation. The gap in verbal signal doesn't need to be interpreted, and no alarm activates. A silence that has no visible cause. Two people sitting with each other, mid-conversation, mid-connection, and nothing, carries maximum ambiguity, which the monitoring system tends to resolve toward the most threatening available interpretation. This connection may be at risk, action is required. And here's the layer that most people find genuinely surprising about their own behavior. The action taken in response, saying something, anything, specifically to end the silence, is not experienced as a deliberate choice. It feels like a response, a social necessity, almost a reflex. This is because the speech itself originates partly from the social threat response rather than from any communicative intention. You're not deciding to talk. Something closer to an alarm response is generating speech as a way of restoring the social signal whose absence was triggering discomfort, which is why afterward you can sometimes have the specific experience of not quite knowing why you said what you said, or noticing that it didn't quite connect to what was being discussed, or feeling that the words were less about communication and more about occupying the space that silence had opened. This also explains a specific dynamic that many people notice in relationships over time. The more comfortable two people become with silence, the closer they typically feel. This isn't a coincidence or a sentimental correlation. It's a functional one. The ability to sit in silence with another person without activating the threat response reflects a genuinely reduced need for continuous verbal confirmation that the connection is intact. The relationship has accumulated enough history, enough stability, enough demonstrated reliability that the social monitoring system operates at lower baseline vigilance, and silence becomes simply quiet rather than evidence that something is wrong. Conversely, a compulsive need to fill silence in a relationship is often a signal, in the system's terms, that the connection hasn't yet produced enough accumulated security to tolerate gaps in the ongoing verbal confirmation signal. This isn't always about the relationship being unstable. It can also reflect a general baseline hypervigilance in the social monitoring system. The same phenomenon that produces discomfort with silence in any context, regardless of the specific relationship or its actual stability. So what do you do with this? First, recognize the specific quality of the discomfort when silence opens. It has a distinct texture, a mild urgency, a reaching quality, a sense that something needs to be done. Learning to identify that texture specifically, rather than simply following it immediately into speech, creates a small but real pause between the trigger and the response. Second, practice the minimal intervention. Instead of filling silence with new content, try simply acknowledging it directly. A brief, comfortable exhale, a small nod, maintained eye contact without words. These signals communicate presence and engagement without the implicit message that silence is something requiring rescue. And over time, they train the monitoring system to accept brief gaps in verbal signal as neutral rather than alarming. Third, notice the relationship between silence comfort and relationship depth. If you find certain relationships significantly more exhausting than others, it's worth asking whether the exhaustion correlates with the absence of comfortable silence, whether you're doing continuous conversational maintenance work to keep the social monitoring system at rest, rather than genuinely resting in the presence of another person. Here's what ties this together. The urge to fill conversational silence is not small talk instinct, introversion versus extroversion, or personal awkwardness. It's a specific alarm response from the part of your brain responsible for monitoring social connection in real time, triggered by a gap in the verbal signal that continuous conversation provides. Understanding that the alarm is not evidence of an actual social emergency, that 4 seconds of quiet between two people is not the beginning of disconnection, is the beginning of learning to sit inside silence without immediately needing to end it. And in that capacity, paradoxically, real connection tends to deepen rather than dissolve. If this explains something you recognize in yourself, Tell us in the comments about a specific moment where you said something in a conversation specifically to fill the silence, and whether you even knew why you were saying it at the time. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind your own social behavior, the next video is right there.